At 4:10 on the morning of August 18th, 1943, a 63-foot wooden motor torpedo boat lay motionless against the mangrove fringe of a narrow inlet on the northern coast of New Guinea. The craft was officially designated PT-59. Those torpedo tubes had been removed weeks earlier. Its silhouette, low and angular, was broken by palm shadows and irregular vertical lines of swamp timber. The boat's hull rested in brackish water measuring between 1.4 and 1.8 meters deep, fluctuating with a tidal pull from the Vichiaz Strait to the north. The crew consisted of 13 men. For the purposes of this account, attention remains fixed on one individual. Lieutenant Junior Grade, John F. Kennedy, United States Navy Reserve, age 26, commanding officer of the vessel. He had been aboard since 3:25, awake since the previous afternoon, and had not removed his life vest since 2,200 hours the night before. His station at this hour was a forward starboard gun position, slightly aft the bow, where a jury-rigged .50 caliber Browning M2 heavy machine gun was mounted on a pintle welded directly to the deck beam. The Browning M2 weighed approximately 38 kilograms for the receiver and barrel assembly alone, with the improvised mount adding another 12 kilograms. It fired the .50 BMG cartridge, 12.7 by 99 millimeters, belt-fed, recoil-operated, air-cooled. The cyclic rate was between 450 and 600 rounds per minute, though in practical short bursts Kennedy rarely exceeded 100 rounds per minute to preserve barrel temperature and maintain control. The weapon was fitted with standard iron sights. No optical enhancement had been added. The trigger pull, heavy and linear, required a deliberate squeeze using both hands braced against the spade grips. PT-59 had been modified in the field. Its original role as a torpedo attack craft was abandoned after repeated encounters demonstrated that Japanese barges operating in coastal waters traveled at low speed, shallow draft, and often in side reefs or river mouths inaccessible to torpedoes. In response, the boat's armament had been reconfigured to emphasize short-range firepower. 2.50 caliber machine guns forward, one 20mm Oerlikon autocannon amidships, and 2.30 caliber Browning M1919S aft. No armor plating protected the crew. The hull planking was mahogany, 38mm thick at the keel, thinner along the sides. Weather conditions at 4:10 were stable. The sky was overcast at approximately 70% cloud cover, with a low ceiling at 900 meters. Wind was minimal, estimated at 2 to 3 knots from the southeast. Visibility over water was limited to roughly 400 meters due to humidity and early morning haze. The moon had set at 3:42, leaving ambient illumination dependent on cloud-filtered starlight. Surface reflections were muted, favorable for concealment. Kennedy faced north-northeast, watching a stretch of open water between two reef lines. This channel, approximately 280 meters wide, had been identified through patrol reports as a habitual transit route for Japanese supply barges, moving men and material between coastal garrisons. These barges were typically wooden, flat-bottomed, 15 to 20 meters in length, powered by low-horsepower diesel engines, and armed with light machine guns or rifles. They operated primarily at night or in the early morning hours, relying on darkness, shallow water, and the assumption that Allied surface forces could not engage them effectively at close range. At 4:18, Kennedy checked his watch using the luminous dial, shielded briefly by his body to prevent light spill. No contact was visible. The boat's engines were shut down. The smell of fuel oil lingered in the humid air, mixed with decomposing vegetation from the mangroves. Insects moved constantly along the gunwale. Sweat accumulated beneath Kennedy's helmet liner and soaked into his shirt collar. He did not wipe it away, minimizing movement. The operational context had developed over the previous 6 weeks. Japanese barge traffic along this coast had increased measurably after Allied air interdiction made daylight shipping hazardous. Intelligence summaries from 7th Fleet indicated that these barges were believed by Japanese commanders to be largely immune from attack by Allied naval forces due to their shallow routes and proximity to shore. Air attacks were sporadic and imprecise at night. Submarines could not operate in such confined waters. Destroyers were too visible and risked grounding. PT boats, however, offered a partial solution. Their shallow draft, high speed, and small profile allowed them to penetrate these areas. But standard torpedo tactics were ineffective. Torpedoes often passed beneath barges or failed to arm. Close-range gunfire became the only viable method of interdiction, placing crews within 50 to 100 meters of enemy fire. Kennedy had assumed command of PT-59 on August 5, 1943, following the loss of PT-109 earlier that month. His experience in coastal operations was recent but intensive. He had already adjusted his expectations. Patrols involved hours of inactivity punctuated by seconds of engagement. Survival depended less on aggression than on patience, timing, and restraint. At 4:31, a faint mechanical sound became detectable to the north. It was intermittent low frequency, consistent with a small diesel engine running at reduced throttle. Kennedy did not immediately raise the alarm. He listened for changes in pitch and rhythm. The sound faded, then returned. Distance was difficult to judge, but he estimated between 700 and 900 meters beyond effective engagement range. By 4:37, the sound stabilized. Kennedy signaled silently to the executive officer after using a prearranged hand signal. Possible contact north. No weapons were traversed. The boat remained still. The plan was to allow any approaching vessel to enter the channel fully, reducing its maneuvering options and increasing the likelihood that it would silhouette against the lighter water beyond the reef. The waiting continued. At 4:52, the first hint of dawn appeared as a slight lightening of the eastern horizon, raising ambient illumination marginally, but not enough to compromise concealment. The risk increased with each passing minute. Japanese barges often accelerated at first light to clear exposed waters. If contact occurred now, it would be close and fast. Kennedy adjusted his stance. He shifted his left foot 10 centimeters aft to relieve pressure on his calf. He checked the ammunition belt, confirming that the first round was seated properly and the belt fed cleanly into the receiver. The barrel was cool to the touch. He rotated the gun 5 degrees to port, aligning it with the channel centerline. At 5:03, a dark shape emerged at the edge of visibility, moving from northeast to southwest. It rode low in the water. No wake was visible beyond a narrow V trailing behind the bow. The engine sound increased slightly, suggesting a speed of approximately 6 to 7 knots. Kennedy estimated the range at 450 meters and closing. No order was given. The engagement doctrine for these patrols placed initial fire authorization with the commanding officer, but the intent was clear. Allow the target to close to under 200 meters before opening fire, maximizing accuracy and lethality while minimizing the duration of exposure. At 5:07, the barge entered the channel proper. Its outline became clearer. A single-deck wooden vessel, approximately 18 meters long, with a small wheelhouse forward of amidships. At least 2 figures were visible as darker vertical forms against the deck. No lights were displayed. At 5:09, the barge closed to an estimated range of 320 meters. Kennedy could now distinguish structural details: a low gunwale, uneven planking along the sides, and a rectangular cargo space aft, partially covered by a tarpaulin. The vessel's bow cut the water quietly. No attempt was made to zigzag or alter course. This behavior was consistent with established Japanese barge doctrine in the area. Steady transit, minimal maneuvering, reliance on concealment rather than evasion. Kennedy kept both hands on the spade grips of the Browning M2, but did not chamber around. The boat remained forward, the feed pawl engaged. He controlled his breathing deliberately, slowing his exhalations to reduce involuntary movement. Sweat ran from his temple down the side of his face and pulled at the edge of his jawline. He did not wipe it away. At 5:11, the barge crossed the midpoint of the channel. Range was now approximately 210 meters. Kennedy glanced briefly to his left to confirm the position of the second .50 caliber gun, manned by a petty officer crouched low behind the receiver. The 20mm Oerlikon amidships remained unmanned, its profile masked by canvas and equipment. The intention was to delay revealing the boat's full firepower until the engagement was unavoidable. Light levels continued to rise incrementally. The overcast sky diffused the growing dawn, producing flat, gray illumination with minimal contrast. Shadows remained soft. The PT boat's dark hull blended with the mangroves behind it. From the barge's perspective, the inlet appeared empty. At 5:13, Kennedy judged the range to be under 180 meters. He raised his right hand briefly and made a downward chopping motion. Fire authorization. Simultaneously, he thumbed the charging handle of the M2, retracting the bolt and chambering the first round. The metallic sound was sharp but brief, absorbed by the surrounding vegetation. He depressed the trigger for a controlled burst of 5 rounds. The Browning recoiled heavily against his mount. The force transmitted through Kennedy's arms and into his shoulders. Muzzle flash was visible but muted by the overcast light. The .50 BMG rounds, each weighing approximately 46 grams, left the barrel a muzzle velocity of around 890 meters per second. Tracer was not used. The belt was loaded with standard ball ammunition to reduce visibility. The round struck the barge along the starboard bow, which splintered outward. One round penetrated the gunwale and exited through the deck, leaving a jagged aperture approximately 40 millimeters in diameter. A second burst followed, this time aimed slightly higher, toward the wheelhouse. The barge reacted immediately. Its engine note surged as throttle was applied. The bow veered to port. A muzzle flash appeared briefly near the wheelhouse, indicating return fire from a light weapon, likely a 7.7 millimeters Type 92 machine gun or a rifle. The return fire was poorly aimed, rounds striking the water short of the PT boat. Kennedy ceased fire after a total of 12 rounds. He observed the effects. The barge's forward momentum slowed abruptly. Smoke or steam vented from the area around the engine housing. One figure collapsed near the wheelhouse opening. Another moved aft, crouching low. At 5:14, the second .50 caliber gun opened fire, delivering a short burst along the length of the deck. Kennedy shifted his aim to the aft section, placing a 3-round burst into the cargo space. The tarpaulin shredded instantly. Secondary impact suggested that at least one round struck metal, possibly fuel drums or equipment stored beneath the cover. The barge's engine sputtered, then failed. The vessel lost headway and began to drift, turning slowly broadside to the channel under the influence of residual momentum and current. Return fire ceased. Kennedy held his fire. He watched for movement. The engagement had lasted approximately 40 seconds. At 5:16, with no further activity observed, Kennedy signaled ceasefire. The PT boat remained concealed. No attempt was made to close with a disabled barge. Standard operating procedure dictated withdrawal after successful interdiction to avoid counterattack from shore positions or additional barges. At 5:18, Kennedy ordered engine started. The PT boat backed slowly out of the inlet, increasing speed only after clearing the mangroves. By 5:25, it was moving at 18 knots on a southerly heading, away from the engagement area. No casualties were sustained aboard PT 59. Ammunition expenditure was minimal, approximately 40 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The first contact of patrol had confirmed prior assumptions. Japanese barges were vulnerable to close-range automatic fire and continued to operate under the belief that such attacks were unlikely. This belief would not persist. At 6:40 on August 18, 1943, PT 59 reduced speed to idle in open water approximately 3.2 nautical miles south of the engagement site. The crew remained at action stations. Dawn had fully broken, but cloud cover remained heavy. Visibility extended to roughly 1,200 meters. The sea state was calm, with wave heights under 0.3 meters. Kennedy stood near the chart table amidships, reviewing patrol area mentally. He did not record the engagement immediately. Radio silence was maintained to avoid direction finding. Intelligence reports indicated that Japanese coastal observers frequently monitored Allied radio traffic following barge losses, adjusting routes and timing accordingly. Fatigue began to assert itself. Kennedy had slept less than 3 hours in the previous 36. His lower back ached from prolonged standing. His hands retained a faint tremor from adrenaline and muscle tension. He flexed his fingers deliberately, maintaining circulation. At 7:05, The boat resumed slow patrol along a parallel course to the coastline, maintaining a distance of approximately 1.5 nautical miles offshore. The objective was observation rather than engagement. Japanese response patterns following barge interdiction were of particular interest: whether additional barges would appear, whether escort craft would be introduced, or whether shore fire would increase. By 8:20, the sun began to break intermittently through the cloud layer, increasing glare on the water surface. Kennedy ordered canvas rigged to reduce reflections from exposed metal surfaces. The 20mm Oerlikon remained covered. The .50 caliber guns were wiped down and relubricated lightly to prevent corrosion in the humid air. At 9:10, a distant aircraft engine was heard. The sound was high-pitched and irregular, consistent with a single-engine reconnaissance aircraft. Kennedy ordered the crew below decks where possible and reduced speed further. The PT boat's profile from the air was minimal, but not invisible. The aircraft did not approach closely. No bombs were dropped. At 9:24, the sound faded to the west. By late morning, it became apparent that Japanese traffic in the immediate area had ceased. This absence itself was informative. The enemy had either detected the patrol or responded to reports of the earlier engagement. At 11:40, PT-59 returned to base for refueling and resupply. Kennedy went below decks for the first time since before dawn. He removed his helmet and sat on an ammunition crate. His shirt was soaked through. Salt residue crusted along the fabric seams. The afternoon passed without incident. Maintenance was performed on the weapons. Spent belts were reloaded. Barrels were inspected for wear and fouling. The Browning M2 showed no signs of overheating. The short bursts had preserved barrel integrity. At 17:30, Kennedy received a briefing from Squadron Intelligence. Japanese barges had resumed movement along an alternate route approximately 6 nautical miles east, closer to shore and under the coverage of small-caliber shore guns. Additionally, reports indicated that at least one barge had been fitted with improvised armor plating around the engine compartment. Steel sheets scavenged from wreckage, bolted externally. The enemy was adapting. At 18:45, PT-59 departed again. The mission parameters were unchanged: interdiction through ambush, minimal exposure, rapid withdrawal. The difference lay in the expected resistance. As darkness fell, the crew settled into familiar routines. Engines were throttled back. Weapons were manned. Kennedy returned to the forward .50 caliber position. The air cooled slightly after sunset, but humidity remained high. Condensation formed on metal surfaces. At 21:10, rain began, light but steady. Visibility dropped sharply, reducing effective visual range to under 300 meters. Sound carried differently now, muffled by rainfall on the water surface. At 22:05, Kennedy heard again the low, persistent thrum of a diesel engine, closer to shore this time. He estimated range at 500 meters and closing. The rain provided concealment, but it also reduced reaction time. At 22:17, the barge emerged suddenly from the rain curtain, already inside 250 meters. This one was different. Its silhouette was bulkier. A raised structure amidships suggested additional protection. 2 muzzle flashes appeared almost immediately, indicating that the barge crew had detected the PT boat's outline despite precautions. Kennedy did not hesitate. He opened fire with sustained bursts of 8 rounds, aiming directly at the engine housing. The second .50 caliber joined in. The combined fire stitched across the barge's midsection. Several rounds sparked on impact, confirming the presence of metal plating. Return fire intensified. Tracer rounds cut across the water, passing overhead and striking the mangroves behind PT-59. One round struck the boat's bow, splintering wood but failing to penetrate fully. Kennedy adjusted aim downward, targeting the waterline just below the armored section. The .50 caliber rounds punched through the unprotected hull planking, flooding the engine compartment from below. The barge's engine faltered. At 22:19, the 20mm Oerlikon was uncovered and brought into action. A single round was fired. The high explosive projectile struck the barge's deck near the wheelhouse, detonating on contact. The effect was immediate and decisive. Structural failure propagated along the deck planks. Fire erupted briefly before rain suppressed it. The barge slowed, then stopped. Return fire ceased. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. Kennedy ordered immediate withdrawal. Engine surge. PT-59 accelerated to 35 knots, leaving the rain-shrouded coastline behind. The pattern was clear. Japanese forces had begun to armor critical components and open fire earlier, abandoning the assumption of immunity. Future engagements would be more dangerous, shorter, and more lethal on both sides. At 040 on August 19, 1943, PT-59 reduced speed to idle approximately 4 nautical miles southeast of the previous night's engagement area. The rain had tapered to intermittent drizzle, leaving the air saturated and heavy. Cloud cover remained complete. No moonlight penetrated the overcast. Ambient illumination was limited to diffuse starlight, reflected weakly off the water's surface. Kennedy remained forward, hands resting on the spade grips of the Browning M2. His posture was unchanged from earlier patrols. Knees slightly bent, torso leaning forward, weight balanced to absorb recoil. He had consumed no food since midday. A canteen hung and used at his side. Dehydration was beginning to manifest as a dull pressure behind the eyes and a dryness at the back of the throat. At 057, the boat entered a new patrol sector. This stretch of coast was less vegetated, with rocky outcroppings replacing mangroves. The shoreline rose gradually to low hills, elevations between 20 and 40 meters, covered in scrub and scattered trees. These hills provided potential observation and firing positions for Japanese shore units. Kennedy scanned continuously, sweeping his gaze in slow, deliberate arcs from left to right, pausing at each sector boundary. He avoided rapid head movements. Experience had taught him that sudden motion degraded night vision and increased fatigue. He relied on peripheral vision to detect movement rather than focusing narrowly. At 1:14, a faint glow appeared intermittently along the shoreline. Small, brief points of light consistent with cigarette embers or shielded lanterns. Kennedy noted their positions mentally but did not react. Shore personnel were common and not by themselves an immediate threat. The sound of engines reached him at 1:22. This time there were 2 distinct notes, close in pitch but slightly offset in rhythm. 2 barges, operating in loose formation. The sound was steady, unhurried. Kennedy estimated range at approximately 600 meters and closing. PT-59 remained motionless, engines shut down completely. The boat drifted slowly under residual momentum and current, its bows swinging a few degrees starboard. Kennedy compensated by adjusting the gun's traverse, keeping the expected approach lane centered. At 1:31, the barges came into view. They were traveling parallel to the shore, heading west. Separation between them was roughly 80 meters. Both vessels displayed similar modifications to the one encountered earlier: reinforced midsections, low-profile superstructures, and forward-mounted light weapons. Kennedy observed carefully. He counted silhouettes. On the lead barge, at least 4 figures were visible. On the trailing barge, possibly 3. No escort craft were present. No shore fire was active. He waited. At 1:36, the lead barge altered course slightly, angling toward the open water. This maneuver suggested an attempt to bypass the nearshore patrol zone. The trailing barge followed suit, maintaining spacing. Kennedy judged that if they continued, both barges would pass outside effective engagement range within minutes. He made his decision. At 1:38, he signaled for engines to start. The PT boat's Packard gasoline engines turned over with a brief mechanical clatter, then settled into a low rumble. Speed increased to 10 knots. The boat angled to intercept, closing the distance rapidly. The barges reacted almost immediately. The lead vessel increased speed. Muzzle flashes appeared from its forward position. Tracer rounds streaked across the water, falling short but clearly directed. Kennedy opened fire at 1:39. He fired a controlled burst of 6 rounds at the lead barge's bow, aiming to suppress its forward gunner. The second .50 caliber engaged the trailing barge simultaneously. The effect was immediate. The lead barge's fire faltered. One figure disappeared from view. The trailing barge returned fire more effectively, its round striking the water within meters of PT-59's hull. Kennedy adjusted his aim, lowering it slightly to target the trailing barge's engine compartment. He fired another burst. Several rounds struck the armored plating, producing bright sparks and deflecting fragments. One round penetrated below the armor line, indicated by a sudden plume of water and debris. At 1:41, shore fire joined the engagement. Small caliber rounds, likely from rifles or light machine guns, began impacting around PT-59. The sound was distinct. Sharp cracks followed by splashes or dull thuds against wood. One round struck the gunwale near Kennedy's left knee, embedding itself without penetrating fully. Kennedy did not look down. He maintained fire discipline, firing only when he had a clear sight picture. The Browning's barrel heated rapidly now, radiating warmth. He shortened his burst to 3 rounds. At 1:43, the lead barge veered sharply toward shore, attempting to beach itself or reach the protection of land-based weapons. The trailing barge slowed abruptly, possibly damaged. The distance between PT-59 and the trailing barge closed under 90 meters. Kennedy seized the opportunity. He fired a sustained burst of 10 rounds along the length of the trailing barge, starting at the bow and walking the fire aft, which splintered violently. One round detonated something internal, possibly ammunition or fuel, producing a brief flash and secondary fragmentation. Return fire from the trailing barge ceased. The vessel lost way and began to lift slightly to port. The lead barge, now closer to shore, continued firing sporadically. Kennedy shifted focus back to it. The 20mm Oerlikon was brought to bear again. At 1:45, 2 rounds were fired in quick succession. The first struck short, detonating in the water. The second impacted the barge's stern, tearing away planking and disabling its propulsion. The engagement ended abruptly. Both barges were disabled. Shore fire intensified briefly, then diminished as PT-59 increased speed and withdrew seaward. By 1:50, the PT boat was clear of effective range. Engines were pushed to 38 knots. Kennedy ceased fire and stood motionless for several seconds, assessing. His ears rang faintly. His arms ached from sustained recoil management. No casualties were reported aboard PT-59. The hull had sustained minor damage. Several bullet impacts. One partial penetration forward. No flooding. At 2:30, Kennedy ordered a course change to the south, away from the coastline. The patrol would not return to that sector that night. The engagements of August 19th demonstrated a clear escalation. Japanese barges now operated in pairs, initiated fire earlier, and coordinated with shore units. The environment was becoming more hostile, the margin for error narrower. Fatigue deepened. Kennedy remained awake. He leaned briefly against the gun mount, allowing his weight to rest on the metal. His breathing was steady. His focus did not waver. The patrol continued until dawn without further contact. At 5:58, first light revealed a calm sea and an empty horizon. PT-59 turned back toward base. The operational pattern had changed. Ambush was no longer one-sided. Each engagement now carried increased risk, and each success prompted further enemy adaptation. At 14:20 on August 19, 1943, after less than 6 hours of fragmented rest, Kennedy was back aboard PT-59. Sleep had been shallow and intermittent, interrupted by residual engine noise perceived even in silence. His muscles remained tense. Fine motor control in his hands was intact, but endurance fatigue was evident in slower movements and longer pauses between actions. Weather conditions had shifted slightly. The overcast persisted, but cloud density had increased and barometric pressure had dropped. By late afternoon, scattered squalls were expected along the coast. Sea state remained moderate, with low chop and occasional swells refracting off the reef lines. At 15:05, Kennedy supervised the inspection of the forward .50 caliber mount. The barrel was replaced as a precaution. The spent barrel showed early signs of throat erosion, but remained serviceable. Ammunition belts were reconfigured. Alternating ball and armor-piercing incendiary rounds were introduced. The API rounds, identifiable by their silver tips, weighed slightly more and offer improved penetration against thin steel plating, and increased incendiary effect upon impact with fuel or ammunition. This change reflected a tactical adjustment. Japanese barge armor, though crude, had proven capable of deflecting standard ball ammunition at shallow angles. The API rounds increased lethality but also produced visible sparks and flash, increasing the risk of detection. At 1740, PT-59 departed again, this time assigned to a narrower coastal corridor identified through reconnaissance as a new preferred Japanese route. The water here was shallower, averaging 2.2 meters, with coral heads rising irregularly. Navigation required reduced speed and constant vigilance. Kennedy positioned himself forward by 1810. The sun set at 1824. Twilight faded quickly under heavy cloud cover. By 1845, visibility was again limited to under 300 meters. At 1912, rain began abruptly. This was heavier than previous nights, short, intense bursts that reduced visibility to less than 150 meters and flattened surface reflections. Engine noise carried poorly in these conditions. Both sides benefited from concealment. Both suffered reduced warning time. At 1937, contact occurred suddenly. A single barge appeared off the port bow at approximately 120 meters, closer than any previous encounter. Its engine was already at high throttle. The vessel was moving fast for its class, estimated at 9 knots. A forward-mounted weapon opened fire almost immediately. Kennedy reacted without hesitation. He fired a short, violent burst of 4 rounds directly into the barge's bow. One API round struck metal, producing a bright flash even through the rain. The barge returned fire, round striking the PT boat's hull and superstructure. One round passed within centimeters of Kennedy's head, audible as a sharp crack. He adjusted aim slightly higher, targeting the wheelhouse. Another burst. The API rounds penetrated the thin planking. The wheelhouse collapsed inward partially. Return fire diminished, but did not stop. At 1939, the barge altered course sharply, attempting to ram or pass close aboard. The distance closed under 60 meters. Kennedy swung the gun hard to starboard, tracking the target. The Browning's reverse resistance increased under load, but the mount held. He fired continuously for 3 seconds. Approximately 25 rounds left the barrel. The effect was catastrophic. The barge's engine compartment ignited. Flames spread rapidly despite the rain. The vessel lost control, veered away, and began to slow. Kennedy ceased fire immediately. The engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds. PT-59 did not linger. Engine surged, pulling the boat clear before shore fire could respond. At 1945, tracer fire erupted from the shoreline. Rounds arced harmlessly behind the retreating PT boat. No pursuit followed. The significance of the encounter lay not in its outcome, but in its proximity. Engagement distances were shrinking. Reaction windows were measured in seconds. Surprise now favored whichever side detected the other first, regardless of prior planning. At 21:10, PT-59 resumed patrol further offshore. Kennedy remained alert, but increasingly aware of cumulative fatigue. His shoulders ached. His jaw was clenched unconsciously. He forced himself to relax his grip on the gun between scans. At 22:30, 2 barges were detected at long range, over 800 meters, hugging the shoreline tightly. They did not alter course when PT-59 maneuvered to intercept. Instead, they accelerated and disappeared into a river mouth protected by sandbars and shallow water inaccessible to the PT boat. This avoidance behavior was new. Japanese crews were now actively evading contact, abandoning supply runs rather than risk engagement. The strategic effect was indirect but meaningful, disruption without direct destruction. At 23:55, another contact occurred. This time it was different. A low, fast-moving craft approached from the northwest. Its engine note was higher-pitched, smoother. Kennedy identified it as a Japanese motor launch rather than a barge. Smaller, faster, likely tasked with patrol or interception. The launch opened fire at 300 meters. Its fire was accurate and sustained. Kennedy returned fire immediately, firing API rounds in short bursts. Several rounds struck the launch's hull, but its speed and maneuverability made tracking difficult. At 23:58, the launch executed a tight turn and withdrew toward shore, laying down suppressive fire as it went. Shore batteries joined in briefly, then fell silent. The enemy was no longer purely reactive. Dedicated counter-patrol assets had been introduced. By 1:30 on August 20th, PT-59 disengaged entirely and returned to base. Kennedy did not sleep upon arrival. He filed a concise after-action report, noting the introduction of patrol launches, increased shore coordination, and reduced barge traffic. The escalation was complete. What had begun as opportunistic interdiction had evolved into an active coastal contest. Both sides were learning. Both sides were narrowing their margins. Kennedy returned to the forward gun position again the following night. Despite visible exhaustion, no replacement was available. His presence forward was deliberate. The commanding officer's role was not abstract. It was physical, exposed, and immediate. At 18:10 on August 20th, 1943, PT-59 departed on what would become its most consequential patrol of the week. Intelligence suggested a concentrated Japanese resupply effort timed to exploit deteriorating weather and reduced Allied air activity. Multiple barges were expected to move under cover of darkness, potentially with escort. Kennedy reviewed the plan briefly. The objective was not to pursue every contact, but to strike decisively at one point, demonstrating that no route was safe. Weather conditions were unfavorable. Rain squalls moved unpredictably. Wind increased to 8 to 10 knots. Sea state deteriorated slightly, with confused chop near the reefs. At 1940, the first contact was detected. 3 barges in line abreast, moving slowly but deliberately. Range was approximately 700 meters. A patrol launch followed 150 meters astern. Kennedy waited until 1952, allowing the formation to compress as it entered a narrow channel between reefs. He then ordered full power. PT-59 surged forward, engines roaring. The enemy reacted instantly. All vessels opened fire. Tracers saturated the water ahead. Kennedy opened fire with sustained bursts, targeting the lead barge. API rounds punched through its bow plating. The second .50 caliber engaged a patrol launch. The 20 mm Oerlikon fired twice in rapid succession. The engagement was chaotic but brief. One barge exploded after a secondary detonation. Another grounded itself deliberately on a reef. The patrol launch withdrew under heavy fire, damaged but operational. Shore fire intensified. PT-59 took multiple hits. One round penetrated the deck aft, wounding a crewman non-fatally. Kennedy remained forward throughout, firing until ammunition ran low. He ceased fire only when order withdrawal was unavoidable. By 20:02, PT-59 disengaged at maximum speed. The decisive factor was not destruction but disruption. The Japanese formation was broken. The resupply attempt failed. In the days that followed, Japanese barge traffic along that sector declined sharply. Routes shifted again, longer and less efficient. Supply tonnage delivered decreased measurably. The assumption of immunity was permanently broken. PT-59 sustained cumulative damage, but remained operational. The crew's fatigue was evident. Kennedy himself showed signs of physical strain, but continued to command forward. No single engagement altered the strategic balance. Collectively, these actions forced adaptation, caution, and delay. Lightly armed boats, properly employed, had contested waters once considered safe. What was proven was limited and specific. Vulnerability existed where certainty had prevailed. It was not decisive in isolation. It was consequential in accumulation.